Alright, so what we're going to do today is take a look at the multiplication rule of algebra. We're going to talk about multiplying real numbers, and our objective today is going to be multiply real numbers using properties of multiplication. So the first thing that we want to actually look at is a certain rule in math that we have to abide by from here on out. So the product of a positive number and a negative number is always going to be a negative number. All right, so that's rule number one that we need to abide by. So we have rule number one. Now rule number two is going to be the product of two negative numbers is always going to be a positive number. So a positive times a negative equals a negative. A negative times a positive will be a negative, and then a negative times a negative will always be a positive. So next, looking at some actual practice problems here. Find the product. So 1/2 times negative 26. Well, what does that equal? We have a positive times a negative, so automatically we know that we're going to have a negative number. So that would equal negative 13. Next, moving on. One thing that we can do here is actually count how many factors we have that are negative numbers. So we have 1, 2, 3. So automatically you know that you're going to have a negative because we have an odd amount of negative numbers. So a negative times a negative equals a positive. So negative 1 times negative 5 would actually be positive 5. So we have that here from these two. And then 5 times negative 6 would actually be negative 30. So there we go. And then moving on, negative times a positive has to be a negative. So that negative number would be negative 24. And then negative 24 times negative 1/3. We now have an even number of negatives. We actually will have to have a positive number. So we have 24 divided by 3, or we have positive 8. So that's what we want to take away from this actual practice set, is that whenever we have an odd amount of negative numbers, our product will always be negative, and when we have an even amount of negative numbers, we're going to have a positive product. So perfect. So next, some more practice. Find the product. So now we know that we're going to have 4 factors of negative 1, because another way to write this would be negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1. Now, obviously, for a quiz or a test, I'm not going to force you to write all of this stuff out, but this is just another way to actually look at it. So we actually have the 4 here, which tells us that we have 4 factors, and our base is negative 1, so 1, 2, 3, 4. Matching up with our 4, we have an even amount of negative factors, so our answer will have to be a positive number, and negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1 is simply just 1. But now we can actually just look at the exponent. We can actually look at the power that our exponential expression here is going to be raised to, and our base is negative 1, so we have to have a positive number. And next, simplify the expression. Negative times a negative, simply just multiply the 2 and then the coefficient of x here. We know we have to have a positive number because we have an even amount of negative terms, so 14x. And then next, moving on, a little trickier here. Another way to think of this is the opposite of y squared. Well, that would just give us the opposite of y squared right here perfectly, because the base now is actually 1 of this exponent. It's actually not going to be negative y squared to give us a positive y squared. So it's a tricky problem, but nothing we can't handle here. Once again, negative, negative, so we have to end up with a positive. So we end up with 8t squared. Perfect. And then here we have negative, 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 so our answer will yield a negative number. So 4 cubed right there. Perfect, 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 perfect. Moving on to another one. I think we got the idea here, but properties of multiplication. A couple of properties that we need to go over. The commutative property of multiplication. Well, the commutative property means that it doesn't matter in which way we actually multiply numbers. Think back to the addition property that we had before. We had a commutative property of addition. Well, now we have a commutative property of multiplication. Commutative property of addition just tells us that, well, whenever we add two numbers together, it doesn't matter in which way we add them, we're going to get the same number, like 2 plus 3 equals 5. Well, that's also going to equal 3 plus 2, which is 5. This also works out for multiplication. 3 times negative 2 will be the same as negative 2 times positive 3. You end up with your negative 6 equals negative 6. So it should come out to be that true statement. Well, the other thing that we have is the associative property here. The way you group your three numbers when multiplying does not change the product. So right here, you could take the product of these two and multiply it by another number. Well, that'll equal the same thing as the number that you had here, the term, multiplied by the product of here. So once again, the order in which we multiply our numbers is not going to matter. The way in which we group them will not matter. Negative 6 times 2, that'll be negative 12. So negative 12 times 3. Well, we know that we have to do what's inside the parentheses first again, so we end up with negative 6 times 6 here. Well, negative 6 times 6 is negative 36. And then negative 12 times 3 will give me negative 36. So perfect. So that would be the commutative property, the associative property, the way in which we do our multiplication in terms of going from one number to the other. The way in which two numbers are multiplied will not matter. Our final answer will not change. And the way in which we group our numbers when multiplying does not change the actual product. Some other properties of multiplication that we need to go over. The identity property. So the property of a number and 1 is the number. Think back to the identity property of addition, where we had a number plus 0 gives us that original number. That's the whole point, is to get back to the original number. What number can I multiply any single real number by to get back to that original number? Well, that would be the number 1. So in our example here, we have negative 1. We have negative 4 times 1, which would give us negative 4. Perfect. The property of 0 in multiplication. Any number times 0 will give us 0. Perfect. That one's kind of self-explanatory. And then the property of opposites. Well, opposites back in addition meant that if we added the two a number and its opposite together, we would get 0. So for example, 2, the opposite of 2 would be negative 2. So 2 plus negative 2 would actually give us 0. So the product of a number and negative 1 is the opposite of the number. For example, if I gave you 2 right here, negative 1 times 2 would actually give me the opposite of that number. So for here, negative 1 times negative 3, the opposite of negative 3 would actually be positive 3. So perfect. If I were to give you 1/2, well, negative 1/2 times 1 will actually give me the opposite of 1/2, which is negative 1/2. So that's what we mean by the property of the opposite. So looking at a couple of practice problems here, evaluate the expression. Kind of plug in some things in here. So we have negative 15 times 3. Well, just input that value. So now we have all of those different types of properties at our disposal. Negative 15 times 3. Well, that's just going to be negative 45. Here we want to input, and one of the toughest ones that we have here is when we have an exponent, and then we actually have the negative number. So now we have a negative base. So this is actually going to come out to be 5 times the negative 2 here. And now what we're looking at, well, negative 2 squared is just going to be positive 4. So we have negative 4 times positive 4. And then we have positive 5 times negative 10. 4 plus negative 10 here. And now the problem just comes down to, well, negative 4 times 4 would be negative 16. And then negative 16 plus a negative 10 will actually give us, now we're going to go back to some of our addition rules, negative 26. Perfect. Well, I have some other practice problems on here for you to do if you'd like. We have a couple here looking at the property of opposites right here too, and then plugging in another number where the base is going to be a negative number. Also another word problem that you can kind of take a look at here for your homework, and then we can talk about that tomorrow. But your homework assignment for tonight is going to be pages 96 to 97 in the Algebra 1 McDougall-Littell textbook through numbers 22 to 48 even, and then 65. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me. We can go over these in greater detail at one day after school, but if not, we'll talk about them in class tomorrow.